Welcome. This is a session that the Leo School and as well as the Socialist Project is sponsoring, titled The Lessons and Legacy of Venezuela's Bolivarian Revolution. And for that purpose, today we are joined by Gregory Wilpert. I cannot tell you, in terms of somebody who's been dedicated to covering the Venezuelan revolution and dedicated professionally, politically, as well as playing a role of facilitator and knowledge builder in this endeavor. We couldn't have had a greater expert on this issue than Gregory Wilpert. And let me also introduce myself. I'm Sharmini Peries. I'm a journalist with the Analysis.News, a place where we try to do analysis on current events. So it's been 26 years since Hugo Chávez first assumed the presidency of Venezuela in 1999. And since then, Venezuela has gone through enormous ups and downs and struggles, particularly since Nicolas Maduro took over. But that is a demarcation made by a lot of Western press, as if there was no struggle and as if there was no fight to retain the power that the revolution had created by the kind of really common, ordinary people living in Venezuela, taking power and expressing the will of the people in terms of where they wanted their nation, their country, and their government to lead them. And so it's a fight that they had to go through again and again and again through elections, referendums, reaffirming the power. So then it's quite appropriate that we have Greg Wilpert here, who actually wrote the book called Changing Venezuela by Taking Power. So Greg is a German-American sociologist and journalist who has covered Latin America extensively for a wide number and variety of publications. He holds a Ph.D. in sociology from Brandeis University, and he's the author, as I said, of Changing Venezuela by Taking Power, and History and Politics of the Chavez Government, and it's a Verso Book publication. And he was also the co-founder of a very important website called Venezuela Analysis. And it got started up during the revolution, and it was the only source of really clarity one could get in terms of what was going on in Venezuela if you were a follower of that revolution and you really wanted to rely on a source that not only reflected the struggles that the people were going through, but really tried to do some honest journalism, which was polarized in the mainstream media in one way or another, and you couldn't really get the true story. So in that sense, we are really honored to welcome Gregory Wilpert to this talk and to Toronto. He's give a big hand to Gregory.
Thank you so much for the introduction and also for the invitation to speak here. This is my first time in Toronto, but it's actually the first time in a while that I've been speaking publicly about Venezuela. I've been very much involved in other projects and so on, and so Sharmini invited me to revisit some of the events in Venezuela and to talk about, well, what are, essentially what now, it's been over 25 years, 26 years since Chavez was first became president. And so this might be a good time to look back and see, well, what's come out of it, because right now Venezuela is receiving a lot of bad press. Most people, particularly on the left, will have a tendency to pretty much ignore what's going on in Venezuela because of that bad press. Of course, it's always had bad press, but for a long time, particularly during the Chavez presidency, it was something that was regarded very highly. That is, the Bolivarian Revolution was regarded very highly by many people around the world. And I would even argue that that it contributed to what was then called the pink tide of the early 2000s, when one government after the other became basically progressive or leftist, and it was really a signal of a very significant sea change in world politics at the time. A lot of that, of course, has changed since then. So now what I want to do is look back a little bit and see what has become of that legacy. So let me just go over quickly what I want to cover today. So to make sure that we're all more or less on the same page, I want to give a very brief history of the Bolivarian Revolution. Then I want to go over what did the Bolivarian Revolution set out to do, what did it actually achieve, then how and why did it fall short of its aims, particularly after Chávez's death, and then what are the lessons of the Bolivarian Revolution for the left, or what lessons can we draw? And I'll be talking about this, all of these points, looking at 3 or 4 different dimensions. That is the politics, the economy, the international context, and then also on the level of what I like to call just consciousness or political consciousness. I think that's an important dimension that the left tends to ignore and forget about. So let me start, as I said, with the brief history. Now, of course, we need to start. It's always a question, well, where do you start on these kinds of things? I want to start here with Venezuela before Chávez and the Bolivarian Revolution. The main point here, and I just, it's really a very quick nutshell explanation. I think the main thing here to keep in mind is that Venezuela is the country with the largest oil reserves in the world. At the time, that wasn't known, but in the meantime, that has been established even by OPEC, that Venezuela has larger oil reserves than Saudi Arabia. Now, it's not the largest oil producer by far. I think right now Venezuela produces something like between 1/4 and 1/3 of what Saudi Arabia produces, or maybe even less. The other important little tidbit to keep in mind is that Venezuelan oil is extra heavy crude mostly. Its light oil reserves and regular oil reserves are mostly depleted now, and so it relies very heavily on extra heavy crude. The other thing to keep in mind about Venezuela before Chávez is that it was a highly dysfunctional political system by the 1970s and 80s. That is, what I mean by that, it was the electoral system, even though Venezuela was considered to be one of the first democracies of Latin America, having democratic elections, or quote-unquote, in quotation marks maybe one should put them, because it was relatively limited in terms of participation. But after the fall of the dictatorship in 1958, it was one of the first, but eventually became highly corrupt, highly dysfunctional, riddled with fraud, and also with blatant, outright censorship. And this became particularly bad in the 1980s and 1990s, which was the time when Chávez started entering the political stage, so to speak. That is, in 1992, Hugo Chávez was a key figure because he organized a coup attempt, a left-wing coup attempt against the government of the time. But then he realized, or he became convinced for various reasons, that maybe an electoral route is feasible, and after he was pardoned in 1994, he decided to run for president for the elections in 1998. And his campaign was basically one to end poverty, to end corruption, and to revitalize Venezuelan democracy. And he succeeded, winning a significant majority at the time in 1998, and introduced a new constitution shortly thereafter, which he had promised during his campaign that he would do, and it passed with an overwhelming majority, something like 70% of the vote. And this, of course, scared a lot of the old elites in Venezuela, and they started organizing against him. This was, so by the time, in other words, at first, when Chávez was first elected in 98, he actually got in with significant support from the country's old elite. But he then essentially started to turn against them. And that's why they turned against him. And by 2002, they organized a coup against him in April of 2002, which was successful for 2 days. This was wonderfully documented in the documentary that some of you might have seen, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. eventually, with the popular support and also with the support of an important segment of the military, he came back into office. This was then followed a couple months later with an attempt by the opposition to shut down the country's oil industry, and he managed to reverse that too with the help of the oil industry working class, basically. And this set the stage essentially for Chávez's own radicalization. So this is the next phase, the second phase, basically his radicalization and consolidation of power from 2004 to 2010 is more or less. These dates, is kind of, or the years are kind of difficult to really pin down, but these are kind of rough estimates of these time periods. The main thing he did during this time was to introduce essentially a participatory democracy of sorts. He wanted to, and this, I'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but one of the main things that he set out to do was to question the representative political system, saying that it was essentially an elitist political system and needed to be complemented by a participatory democracy. And what he meant by that is by setting up communal councils, which were radical democratic institutions of 150 to 400 families, and that they would participate in the governance of the country. Like I said, I'll say more about it a little bit later. The other important element of Chávez during this, of his policies during these years, was the introduction of a very solidly anti-imperialist foreign policy. What I mean by that, he's focused a lot on South-South cooperation, introducing many new regional organizations to counter U.S. imperialism, and to basically reorient the Venezuelan economy to be less reliant on the United States and more in support of other countries in the global south. And then finally, the third thing was that he also reversed a lot of, or actually practically all of the country's neoliberal economic policy. He basically embarked on an anti-neoliberal, was the first government really of the early 2000s to embark on an anti-neoliberal economic policy. Now the next phase was really his illness, his re-election, and then his death, which all happened in very short succession of one another. That is, in 2011 he was diagnosed with cancer. He went for a number of treatments to Cuba, and the cancer was declared to be in remission. And so then he ran for president again for re-election in 2012, which he won overwhelmingly with 60% of the vote. Unfortunately, shortly thereafter, he was diagnosed again with a recurrence of his cancer in late 2012, and then in 2013, in March of 2013, he passed away because of the cancer. Shortly before he died, though, he named Nicolas Maduro as being his designated successor. So this really begins the next phase, and I put a whole bunch of years together here, and basically it's the same period of the entire Chavez presidency, that is more or less 12 years that Maduro is in office now, which was more or less what Chavez was, the time that Chavez was president as well, 12 years, or 12 to 13 years roughly. This period of Maduro, though, being in president, has been marked, I would argue, mostly a period of the decline of the Bolivarian Revolution. And now there's various reasons for that, and like I said, I'll be discussing in detail what they are, but first he was re-elected president narrowly, with 51% of the vote. The main reason, though, for the decline of the Bolivarian Revolution are the U.S. sanctions, U.S. economic sanctions. They had been massive, and again, I'll go into a little bit more detail later on about what that's about and why that is so significant and had such a great impact on essentially destroying the Bolivarian Revolution. Which isn't to say that there weren't some self-inflicted wounds as well. And then there was the 2018 presidential election, which Maduro was re-elected, but this was also under cloud because the opposition decided to boycott the election. Actually, it was going to participate in that election, but in the last minute, after intense negotiations to make sure that the opposition had as many opportunities to participate or as fully as possible, they were actually convinced by the US government at the time to withdraw from the election. And they did in the last minute, shortly before the election, and so they boycotted it. The opposition, as usual in Venezuela, was actually divided. There was a more moderate opposition that did participate, but it wasn't enough for them to win. And then there's the 2024 presidential election, which was highly controversial for very good reasons, mainly because the Electoral Council essentially abandoned transparency in publishing the results. But we'll get into that too in a moment. So this is, in a nutshell, brings us to more or less today, what's going on in Venezuela. So now I just want to go over some of the more important accomplishments of not accomplishments, but what to compare. What did the Bolivarian Revolution set out to do with what the end results have been so far? So the first thing, as I said, was participatory democracy, which came out of the critique of representative democracy. To me, this is actually one of the most important points of the Bolivarian Revolution. And I know this is one that people generally tend to ignore or gloss over, but the critique of representative democracy, which is something that Chavez kept on returning to, is usually forgotten. And it's kind of mind-boggling to me that even among the left in the Western world, this tends not to be brought up enough. That is, when we have criticisms of our current political and economic system, we mostly focus on the economic system. And we rarely look at how dysfunctional representative democracy actually is and how it contributes to the problems of capitalism that we all live under. And so I really cannot emphasize this point enough. At least for me, this is one of the most important points. That is, like I said, what they did essentially was the creation of direct democratic communal councils and communes. 150 to 400 families came together to vote on things in a popular assembly, essentially, on what to do in their community. And the reason this was so important, and then they would come together also between 5 and 15 communal councils would come together and form a commune. The reason that this was so important is that these communes and communal councils were largely responsible for deciding how to implement various social programs that the central government provided, whether it was educational programs, health programs, urban land reform programs, or also rural land reform programs, and then also the distribution of public utilities such as electricity and water. All of that, the communal councils and the communes would be involved in that decision-making process. And so it really gave them a lot of say and made these programs a lot more effective probably than they otherwise would have been if they had been centrally managed. Of course, the other thing I should note, communal councils only come into existence when enough people in that community decide to form one. So a huge amount of Venezuelan population is actually not covered by the communal councils just because not enough people have come together to form them. So anyway, I would say roughly a third only of the population actually lives in communities that do have communal councils and communes. So the other half to 2/3 of the population does not have them or does not have properly functioning ones. The government has often tried to send people out into the communities to help them organize, but if they don't have enough of their own initiative to do so, it generally doesn't happen. Okay, this is the point I already said, that the government programs were linked to these communal councils. The other thing that the government tried to do was introduce a more participatory economy. That is, in addition to the critique of capitalism, Chavez tried to make sure that cooperatives received significant support and that people could come together and get favorable loans to form cooperatives, and that even large businesses, even very large businesses, could be turned into cooperatives. And he also encouraged, in some cases, factory takeovers. Then the other element was the distribution of wealth, essentially via the land reform, rural land reform and an urban land reform. Now, these came in fits and spurts. That is, sometimes when the government focused on it, there would be a lot of progress in that area, and sometimes it would be forgotten. So the record on these is a little bit mixed, but this was also something important for the Bolivarian Revolution. And then there was, of course, the increased taxation of foreign oil companies. And this also includes basically the nationalization of some elements of oil production. That is, Venezuela actually always had a nationalized oil industry in the sense that the oil belonged to the state, and and PDVSA, the state-owned oil company, was the main player. But they would invite foreign investment every once in a while, actually to some extent. You could say that something like half of Venezuelan oil production was actually under the control of private companies that were brought in as for advice or for the know-how for producing the oil, and usually they would have slightly less, that is 49% participation in joint ventures, that is. And Chavez changed some of those rules and increased the royalty payments and the taxation of these companies, so the oil revenues were significantly increased for the state. And then the other form of redistribution happened in the form of a massive increase in social programs, that is in health, education, housing, and in poverty alleviation. And this all combined together made Venezuela actually into, by the end of Chavez's presidency, that is by 2012 more or less, made Venezuela into one of the most egalitarian countries in Latin America. That is, if you accept, let's say, Cuba, essentially, because Cuba is really, but if measured by what's known as the Gini coefficient, which is the measure of inequality, Venezuela became one of the, if not the least unequal country. It went from one of the most unequal to the least unequal during the Chavez presidency. So it was a massive transformation, really. And then in the international realm, like I said, Venezuela emphasized South-South solidarity and cooperation, which was through the critique of U.S. imperialism, and increased cooperation with the Global South through the creation of a variety of international associations or regional associations, such as UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations, CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, then ALBA, which was the Bolivarian Alliance for Latin America, and then Petrocaribe, which was a way of providing oil to relatively poor countries in Latin America at very favorable terms. Maybe just to kind of also emphasize a little, if you're looking at what the lessons are and the legacy is, we also have to look at, well, what were the problems? And so one of the main problems here in terms of the communal councils is that, of course, many government officials often try to instrumentalize the communal councils in some way and claim to create clientelistic systems. And this became, of course, even more an issue during the when Venezuela tried to cope with the U.S. sanctions, because poverty increased dramatically during that period, and there was a massive food redistribution program. And so, of course, many government officials would try to steer those to more favorable communal councils, whereas those that were more critical might be ignored. Now, that's a huge problem, of course, and undermines the structures of participatory democracy. The other area that I forgot to mention earlier, that the communes actually also served as a site for economic development. That is, they would get loans or investment for creating communally controlled businesses as well. But of course, there was a constant struggle between unions, government officials, and worker cooperatives. And you could add the communes to that list. So this is a constant contested terrain, really. And no matter, even ministers that I've known who were very, well-intentioned had a very hard time trying to manage these conflicts, because it was very, very difficult, and oftentimes, the grassroots efforts would be drowned out. Now, in terms of, I already talked about redistribution, and like I said earlier, the land reform unfortunately stalled pretty much after Chavez's death. And then, of course, what happened is that after Chavez's death, there was a massive economic crisis, which I'll go into in a moment. But the main consequence, of course, was that it increased inequality significantly. And that started around 2014 and continues to the present to a large extent. So in terms of South-South cooperation, I already talked about UNASUR and CELAC. Now these were really important in terms of creating an alternative to the Organization of American States. The Organization of American States, for anyone who follows it, knows that it's essentially controlled by Washington, D.C., and was regarded in disdain by most of Latin America, essentially, as never really representing their interests because of the way it was organized. And not only that, it had its headquarters in Washington, D.C. UNASUR and CELAC really changed that. Unfortunately, they essentially fell apart after the rightward shift in the early 2010s with the election of right-wing governments. So that was, the pink tide essentially came to an end more or less in the mid-2010s when a lot of governments, for a variety of reasons, and actually one of the things to note, and this is also something that people often forget, is that during this time period, that is in the 2010s, there were not only electoral shifts to the right, but over half of the governments that shifted to the right was actually due to legislative coups, whether it was in Brazil, in Honduras, or actual coups. Honduras, I mean, one country after a whole bunch of them. Unfortunately, I don't have the list in front of me, so I'm not going to give it to you right now because I might make a mistake, but about half of them, the rightward shifted governments, was due to either an outright military coup or due to a legislative coup against the left-wing government. Anyway, so now I just want to shift towards looking at, well, what are some of the reasons for the decline of the Bolivarian Revolution? Essentially, like I said, that happened during the Maduro presidency. Now, like I said before, I want to do this in terms of the polity, the economy, international, and consciousness. So in terms of the polity, the main thing here is, that I like to point out is that there's been always a contradiction between top-down state structures and the creation of new bottom-up participatory democracy. That is, on the one hand, the state continued to be, essentially a top-down state that, on the one hand, tried to promote grassroots participation in participatory democracy, but just the very fact of the existence of a top-down state continued to create contradictions with that very same participatory democracy. And that contradiction was never really resolved. So there are constant conflicts on that level. Then the other element, of course, on the level of polity is the continued existence of a subversive opposition. What I mean by that is one that essentially refuses to participate in normal political process and either is trying to organize an outright coup or trying to organize uprisings of various kinds, or is collaborating with the United States government to overthrow the government in one way or another. Of course, this isn't the entire opposition. It's important to keep in mind that roughly half the opposition, I would say, was willing to participate in the political system and was willing to run for elections and wasn't going to boycott elections all the time and so on. But this division meant that the more radical opposition always had the upper hand because it had the support from the United States. Whereas the domestic, that is the more, so to speak, not complacent, but the more participatory, the one that was willing to participate, opposition, did not have that support and was always basically the underdog during the entire time. Another political problem, I would say, was the overdependence on the charismatic figure of Hugo Chávez. This is also a little bit of a difficult thing to say because on the one hand, Chavez was so instrumental for the Bolivarian Revolution, it's totally understandable that he would be so central to the whole process. But at the same time, he wasn't able to really cultivate an adequate successor, I would argue. Maduro, actually, I would say, on the face of it, he seemed like the best choice, to me at least, when he was first named. But on the other hand, he had lots of limitations that Chavez himself did not have. Chavez was, he was far more charismatic. Chavez was far more charismatic. He was far more engaged with ordinary people, I would say. I think Maduro is quite removed, actually. And he's much more willing to entertain an active debate. Chavez was much more willing to entertain a debate between various sectors of society, something that Maduro is not so willing to engage in. Then, in terms of the economy, of course, you have the persistence of capitalism in Venezuela. Now, Venezuela did not have a revolution the way the Cuban Revolution did. It did not nationalize all industries or anything like that. There was a significant capitalist class that maintained large elements of the economy under its control. And on top of it all, of course, you also have important sectors of transnational capital still involved in Venezuela, not only in the oil sector, but in all other areas of the economy. And then there's, of course, the problem that any revolutionary government will have, which is that global capitalism. It has to act within a global capitalistic context, which means that there are forces that are completely beyond its control, whether it's bond ratings, credit ratings. The international credit system has a huge impact. Then there's the fact that international dispute settlements are governed essentially by the United States. So just to give you one really important example of this is that Venezuela on various occasions would try to nationalize maybe some industries, but they were governed by these international dispute settlements that were controlled by the global north essentially. And then all of a sudden that meant that international assets of Venezuela in other countries could be claimed, and this is essentially what happened with Citgo. Citgo was owned by PDVSA, and through these international dispute settlements that have their origins in various forms of nationalizations, ended up being put on the auctioning block forcibly against Venezuela as well, in order to compensate for the nationalizations, and not only that, in a completely unfair manner, that is completely beyond what those companies that were nationalized actually deserved. Not only that, Venezuela actually had offered to buy them out at market rates, and they refused to receive those payments, and then instead they wanted to go to Citgo, to take possession of Citgo essentially. And that's what's happened. It's actually right now as we speak, the dispute is still going on, but it's been pretty much settled in favor of, actually, I think it's a Canadian company, which is Cristalex, I think. Anyway, and then there's the whole foreign exchange problem, and there's so much that could be said about this. This has been absolutely central, I think, to the economic failures in Venezuela. And I'm not going to go into it right now, but maybe in the Q&A we can talk about it. The whole foreign exchange system, introducing a fixed exchange rate in order to prevent capital flight and to prevent inflation, has all kinds of problems tied with it, and this was a huge Achilles heel for the Bolivarian Revolution. So that's the economic area. Then, of course, the biggest one, as I said earlier, is U.S. imperialism. The U.S. economic sanctions have been massive. Let me just give a quick rundown of what that meant. The sanctions, Obama actually was the first one to introduce sanctions that truly, I mean, you could say the sanctions already started during the Bush years, but none of those sanctions really had that much effect because they were more like targeted on individuals and certain sectors and so on. They didn't really affect the economy much. The first ones that really affected the Venezuelan economy were the sanctions that Obama introduced in 2015. And now it's kind of curious that Obama did this because, after all, he made this opening towards Cuba, eliminating all kinds of sanctions against Cuba during this time in 2014. And then turns around, literally a couple months later, and introduces a whole slew of sanctions against Venezuela. And of course, one of the explanations that one could speculate as to why he did that was because it was precisely because of the opening towards Cuba in order to show that, oh yeah, I'm still hard on whatever, socialism, communism, whatever. And in order to make the opening towards Cuba perhaps a little bit more palatable to certain sectors within the Democratic Party. I think that's a plausible explanation. The immediate effect of those sanctions, even though they were relatively limited, they were first of all completely illegal because just as Reagan had to declare in the 1980s that Nicaragua represented a serious national security threat to the United States, Obama had to do the same and declare Venezuela to be a serious national security threat. And the reason that he had to do that is because that's one of the requirements of US law in order to introduce sanctions. So the first effect, of course, was that in overcompliance, banks started shutting down Venezuelan bank accounts. And so this hampers, of course, all kinds of trade for Venezuela. And so that's why I'm saying that it had an immediate effect in terms of, in all areas. It has repercussions right away. For example, Venezuela constantly needs new investment in order to keep its oil industry going. All of a sudden, access to replacement parts and know-how and so on is drying up, and that means oil production goes down, which means oil revenues start going down, which means an economic crisis. And this 2015, combined with a sharp decline in oil prices shortly before. And so that's the other possible explanation for why Obama did this, was because in 2014 the price of oil tanked, and so Venezuela was seen as being economically vulnerable. And so this was a good time to try to put pressure on the Venezuelan government through sanctions. Then, of course, the other area that the U.S. government has been very active was funding opposition voices, particularly the most radical sectors of the opposition. And then, of course, the coordination of coup attempts. Now, there's one, of course, that I already mentioned in 2002, but there were a number of other efforts to essentially overthrow, including an assassination attempt of Maduro, so this wasn't just one attempt. And then there's the fourth area, and I kind of touched on this already, is I would say that the consciousness problem, or political consciousness problem, is also one affects, is in terms of the overdependence on one leader, on Chavez. This is an issue also of political consciousness. Following top-down structures is also something, in terms of compliance and being able to believe that top-down organizing is better than bottom-up. That's also an issue of political consciousness. Then there's the whole issue of, well, how is that maintained? Which is that for a long time during the Chavez presidency, private mass media and the education system continued to wield a lot of influence over public discourse. So those are all issues related to consciousness. And I would say overall there was no clear idea really on how to deal with this consciousness issue. Chavez over again recognized it as being a problem, but other than countering with maybe more state media outlets and changing maybe the curriculum or something like that, or introducing socialist education and things like that, I would say that all of that wasn't good enough, actually. So then we get to the question of, well, what is the legacy and what are the lessons for the left of the Bolivarian Revolution? So I hope to wrap it up with that. I would say the first thing, in terms of the polity, that, and this is, again, we come back to the point that I mentioned earlier, why it's so important to focus on this, is that it is possible to create a more participatory democracy. And this is not, and oftentimes, and the reason I put this in parentheses here, even when there's an economic downturn, is because so often when people look at the Bolivarian Revolution, they say, oh, Venezuela has all these oil revenues, they were able to do all this because the price of oil was high. Well, this actually has nothing to do with that. The participatory democracy was able to function and be introduced even during economic crisis in Venezuela. So I think that's a crucial point that we should keep in mind, I think, or the left ought to keep in mind. But what was lacking, perhaps, is a clear strategy on how to implement a bottom-up participatory democracy using a top-down centralized state. That's something that, I don't know to what extent that's been theorized, really, because it's not that easy. And like I said, I know people who are in the Venezuelan government who really had a hard time struggling with this problem. Then in terms of the level of the economy, I think one of the main lessons here is that a faster break with capitalist economic structures might have smoothed the way for more economic stability. Now, there's a big caveat to that, of course, which is that in some cases it was very difficult to do that, a faster break, because there was a tremendous amount of fear that this would lead to brain drain, that a lot of competency would be lost. And now I don't know to what extent that those fears are valid. I think in some cases you could point to cases where a farm might have been turned over to the workers, and through disorganization perhaps, or some other reason, production declined. Now actually these are things that need to be analyzed in great detail, because there's all kinds of other reasons why production might have declined. But that was often the fear from government officials, that when that was done, that production would decline. We cannot afford that, and therefore we need to keep the old structures. Then in terms of imperialism in the international context, one of the main lessons here, and this is of course something that I don't know to what extent revolutionary movements really think about this before they get into power, but the opposition of the US is truly fierce. And having a strategy in place on how to deal with US interference is something that is almost absolutely necessary, I think, as long as you have a country such as the United States wielding so much power over a region such as Latin America or the rest of the world, I would say. And I think Chavez did have a strategy of sorts, which was particularly relying on other countries and so to speak, tying them into the Bolivarian Revolution in the form of UNASUR and CELAC and so on. So that was an absolutely essential counterweight. And then, of course, the example that the Bolivarian Revolution set caused other countries to turn towards the left. But all of this fell apart after Chavez's death, unfortunately. And that's what made the sanctions possible. And made them particularly deadly. And then there's another important area that needs to be figured out is a strategy for how to deal with the consciousness problem. This is actually an area that I've dedicated a lot of time on for myself to figure this out, because I think this is absolutely crucial. I'm not going to say too much about it right now, but I do think it's a mistake to assume that just through propaganda you're going to be able to win people over. That's a huge mistake, and that's constantly the assumption, I think, that leftist governments make. And that was the assumption, I think, that both Chavez and Maduro made, and that's not the case. Now, unfortunately, just to kind of interject a kind of an observation about the current situation, and I actually didn't get to the point really about the recent elections, but the loss of faith in the political system is tremendous in Venezuela today. There's a tremendous amount of depoliticization and a general kind of disillusionment with politics in general. Very few people are hopeful for the future because of the economic crisis, which persists to this day. I have so much more I could be saying about the effect and the impact of the sanctions. Venezuela's economy declined by something like 2/3 within a period of 2 years. That is unprecedented practically in world history, because all of its oil exports were basically cut off from the international markets from one day to the next. And it's recovered that oil production and oil exports to a significant amount. It's about at half the level it used to be right now. But a couple of years ago, that is immediately after the most serious sanctions, which were introduced by Trump in 2019, oil production was something like 1/10 of what it used to be, what it was originally. And now it's maybe about a half. That is, instead of producing 2 million barrels per day, currently Venezuela produces more or less 1 million barrels per day. That's a huge impact because Venezuela relies something like 60% of its consumption relies on imports. And so, and 90% of its foreign exchange comes from oil production. So just imagine if 90% of your foreign exchange is cut. That means that 60% of what you were buying is cut down to 6% from what you could afford as a country. And so that meant hunger, that meant a massive economic crisis, which of course led to the massive amount of emigration in Venezuela, which started mostly by populations that were highly educated and had the ability and means to leave. The estimates of exactly how many people emigrated from Venezuela are a little bit unclear because there's all kinds of numbers floating around. Some numbers, not official, there's UN numbers indicate around 6 million. I think the actual number is actually less than that, significantly less, closer to 3 to 4 million. But in any case, out of a population of 30 million, to drop to something like 26 million, that is a huge impact. And especially if they're all mostly managers, doctors, lawyers, engineers, etc. That is a tremendous loss for a society such as Venezuela. And so, and then the other aspect, aside from the tremendous increase in poverty, was of course that medicines are extremely difficult to get a hold of. Some people, Mark Weisbrod of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, together with Jeffrey Sachs, did a great study which looked at Venezuela in great detail and estimated that the sanctions, the first 2 years of sanctions led to something like 40,000 deaths that wouldn't have happened otherwise if it hadn't been for the sanctions. That is a huge thing. 40,000 deaths in 2 years. I mean, sure, right now, more in other places of the world, as we all know, but this is, very significant, and for no good reason other than trying to, overthrow the government. Anyway, so I think these are kind of the main lessons that I would draw from the Bolivarian Revolution. Now, like I said, I think this is an important thing to look back on for the left in general, and we ought to be studying what happened not only in Venezuela but also in other countries where that had revolutions or have been working for it, in order to see what we can learn from each other. So yeah. So with that, I want to thank you and open the floor.
So I guess the critical question, I will start with the leading question to Greg. During the Chavez era, there was so much that was going on that was positive, that really lent itself to a long-term revolutionary transformation in Venezuela, in the sense that it had a lot of petrodollars. Economically, when Chavez took power, the economy was doing very, very well. Second, it had a mass movement, mass, population behind those changes. And although we point to all the obstacles created by the empire, by the United States in particular, there was a lot of positive developments. I know I worked there and I worked for Chavez. We tried to create a real security belt internationally around the developments in Venezuela, and him in particular. And that had a lot of momentum. He was a very popular leader in the left throughout the world. But I don't think we have a handle on what actually really went wrong in those arenas to be able to project and forecast for the development of a left movement. If you're trying to build one, right? I mean, what really went wrong with? I know you touched on the exchange rate being a problem, but what was the issue that one needs to avoid?
You mean now during the Chavez presidency?
Because it leads to the crisis that Maduro is then faced with, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not sure if that's true, actually, that Chavez's errors led to Maduro's errors. I mean, I do think there are some. The most important error that Chavez, I think, committed that did continue and became very much intensified during the Maduro presidency was precisely the exchange rate problem. And so, I'll just use this as an opportunity to talk about that briefly. But already, during the Venezuela has had fixed exchange rates various times, previously, and a fixed exchange rate is okay to maintain as long as you have the international revenues to basically support that policy. And for a long time, Venezuela did. I mean, what happened essentially was during the oil industry strike of 2003, there was a lot of capital flight, and they had to get control over the, and they had a semi-floating exchange rate at that time, and it lost tremendous amount of value. And of course, when you're importing so much and the currency drops so quickly, that means the prices of everything that you import goes up tremendously, and so that provokes inflation within the country. And one way to stop that is by having a fixed exchange rate, and you essentially subsidize that with the oil revenues. You pay for the favorable exchange rate with the oil revenues. And that worked very well, actually, for most of Chávez's presidency. But there were a couple of points in time during the presidency, and now unfortunately I don't have the the graphs here in front of me about how the price of oil fluctuated. But there was a point towards the end of that period of, when I said the height of Chávez's presidency was 2004 to 2010. Well, towards the end, that is of 2010, 2011, there was also another dip in the price of oil, and it became very difficult to maintain the fixed exchange rate. Chávez insisted on maintaining it despite the cost that represented. And by that, what I mean is that, when the price of oil declines, that means when somebody's asking for dollars in order to import stuff, the government might not actually have the dollars to give them for those imports. And so that means that the exchange rate becomes more restricted. That is, it's not not everybody has access to getting that that exchange rate, that official exchange rate. So then they resort to the black market. And then what happens, especially if the government has less and less revenues, more and more people go to the black market. And so then the gap between the black market exchange rate and the official exchange rate becomes larger and larger. And that then increases the opportunities for arbitrage. That is, for people who have access to the favorable exchange rate will exchange it at the favorable rate, let's say it's 1-to-1, and then change it at the black market exchange rate, where it may be 10-to-1, and they'll be able to get 10 times as many bolivars back. That is, they'll exchange 1 bolivar for $1. They go to the black market exchange and exchange the $1 for 10 bolivars. And all of a sudden, their 1 bolivar is 10 bolivars, without doing anything other than going from one market to another. And as that gap gets bigger, that increases the temptations and the tendencies towards corruption tremendously. And this was particularly serious in the oil industry and in the military, which the military controls the borders and controls a lot of the import-export activities, and therefore corruption in those two sectors became enormous. Now that was something that Chávez should have corrected, I think, before he ran for re-election and before he became sick. And he had an opportunity to do so and didn't do it. And Maduro doubled down on that policy. And that's what ended up leading to hyperinflation in 2014, which was absolutely devastating for the Venezuelan economy. Now, of course, the sanctions didn't help, but they didn't really kick in until 2015. So the hyperinflation already happened before that, unfortunately. So that was one of the main things that people point to, and that was really one of the main areas of economic, I would say, mismanagement. And now there's all kinds of other arguments. There's debates among some leftist economists about whether Maduro did the right thing or not. I think it's pretty clear that that was a huge mistake for all both economically, but also in terms of fomenting corruption. And Chávez, I think, was the first one to go in that direction. The other area, I think, was clearly this over-reliance on Chávez, the individual. He always tended to be relatively humble in some sense. He didn't want statues erected for him or anything like that. But at the same time, it was clear he was so central to the Bolivarian Revolution, and no real successors were really developed that could manage the situation the way he did. And that's, I think, highly unfortunate. And what it also means is Chávez, by appointing Maduro, he also kind of undermined internal democracy. Of course, eventually the Unified Socialist Party of Venezuela, the PSUV, had elections, to support Maduro and all that, internal elections, but Chávez already named it, so that was kind of pro forma, really. So that undermined party democracy. And of course that sets the whole stage for further erosion of those kinds of principles within the party, but also in other areas of Venezuelan politics.
Okay, so we're going to open it up. I know lots of people had questions.
Well, I don't mean to say that, I didn't mean to say that the opposition really undermined the creation of communal councils and communes by not participating. They really shoot themselves in their own foot when they don't participate, because they're so important in terms of coordinating, like I said, social programs and making them effective, which isn't to say that those social programs didn't get to those communities. They did, but they would be less effective in terms of their distribution process, and because it would be completely top-down, essentially. And there were many communities where the opposition did participate in the creation, and that's where the whole clientelism problem did come in, because you had government officials who then would see, oh, they're criticizing us all the time, we're not going to cooperate with them, and they're not going to get what they're trying to get, and so on. And so so this is a huge problem, and there's no I never really saw any conscious effort to try to overcome clientelism. I always thought, and this was of course something, when people from the outside looked at it, particularly journalists and so on, they would see that as Chavez's grand strategy, and then compare it to the committees in defense of the revolution in Cuba and so on. I think that's complete nonsense. First of all, they didn't have that same function, but in terms of defending the revolution. But the other thing is that I never saw any evidence that the central government actually tried to encourage clientelism. It's just that this is something that the government officials that were in charge of negotiating with, or in terms of managing that relationship, that they would tend to do that, and would tend to try to so to speak, whip people into line by not giving certain communities. And this didn't happen everywhere. It always depended on who are the lower level people who were involved, and what was their level of consciousness in terms of implementing a participatory democracy. And so it would vary from place to place. But but I would say it's unfortunate that there was no conscious effort on the part of the central government to avoid this, or to keep this from happening. And so therefore, there was a large tendency to that, for this kind of clientelistic relationships to develop. In terms, so there was no, I guess that kind of addresses your question as well. And in terms of trying to send people, having the party function as, so to speak, the promoters of political consciousness, definitely that was a huge effort, particularly in the beginning phases of the creation of the PSUV, which started, I think, in 2007. That is, before that, Chavez had his own party, which was the Movement for a Fifth Republic, MVR was known as, and there were a number of other coalition partners. And he created the PSUV in 2007, which through a huge effort of basically trying to train people in terms of the politics and Marxism and so on. And I joined those early meetings. I remember they were full of enthusiasm and everything, but it really fizzled out after a relatively short amount of time, like after a year or so, and this was unfortunately relatively common, that whatever Chavez would focus on would be done and taken care of in that moment, but as soon as he moved his attention to something else, it would fall by the wayside. And that's also unfortunately happened with the internal organization of the PSUV, and in terms of its efforts also to kind of create cadres that would try to educate the rest of the population and so on. That never really happened to the extent that was necessary, I think.
There was an effort, like Martha Harnica, for example, worked on this issue of trying to build community councils and leadership and so on. Why didn't that work in the Venezuelan context? You want to comment on that?
Well, that's a really tough question. It kind of touches on what I was saying earlier about this idea that you can, just through indoctrination, essentially, that you can convince people to become socialists. I actually think there's a fundamental problem with that idea. That propaganda and educational classes or so are going to be good enough. So that's that is, there's a term that used to be used, is consciousness raising, and actually I think that's what really has to happen, which is kind of different. And what I mean by that is, we don't just adopt an ideology because somebody tells us to. It's much more complex than that. And so we need to look at psychology, I think, actually, to see how that works. How people change their consciousness, and how do they become more empathetic, how do they become more capable of thinking in terms of larger systems that go beyond, let's say, their immediate concerns, and how do they come to understand. I mean, I think certainly a certain level of kind of straight-out education is definitely needed, but it's not enough. And yeah, it was never done systematically enough. And I don't really have an explanation for why. Chavez kept talking about it. I remember once he gave a very famous speech. I think it was in 2008. I can't remember, where he talked about how, and he gave this analogy to he always loved these literary analogies. He was talking about Victor Hugo in Les Miserables, I think it was, who would talk about how the gosh, now I'm going to mangle this quote, but but it was something about how they have dismantled. Oh, shoot! Now I'm going to get told about that. I actually have it here somewhere. But essentially, what he was saying is that the capitalist wind was still blowing, in the form of that this represented the consciousness, even though we've dismantled the structures. The capitalist wind was still blowing and influencing people. Don't paraphrase me on this at all, but it was something like that. And so he was very aware of it. As a matter of fact, in one of his, in the 13 kind of the main program that he had for both his 2006 and 2012 re-election campaign, consciousness was like one of the main points really in both of those programs, but it was never really followed through, and he just didn't have, I think, the resources really to figure it out and to implement it. That's my impression, and I know that Marta Haneke did a tremendous effort to do that, but it was a tiny drop in the ocean. Well, let me just address that one first, because it basically speaks to the point that I said earlier, which is about that I think the Chavez government did not expropriate, did not kind of transform the economy fast enough, and exactly what you're saying, because it left many of the economic structures in place that ended up undermining the entire project constantly. I mean. And so that was a huge issue, and I think if they had acted faster in terms of redistributing and in terms of expropriating important sectors, that might have been avoided. I mean, eventually, many of these sectors were taken care of in one way or another, but it's still, and now still have massive inequality in Venezuela, mainly because of the economic crisis, and that which I've already explained. I trace it to two main factors, which was the sanctions and the exchange rate policy. But that brings me to the other point. But basically, I agree with you. It's very difficult to make a revolution if it's only halfway. I don't have anything else to say about that, really. Regarding though the characterization of the dollarization process, which currently, the dollar is the de facto currency in Venezuela. The bolivar is still being used, but it's mostly being used for basically displaying the prices and for maybe paying things with debit cards, because you cannot really pay in dollars with that debit card. But cash transactions and price setting is all via dollars. So it's essentially a dollarized economy at the moment. And there's a huge problem with that, of course, because it undermines economic sovereignty. But I think given the hyperinflation and given the problems of this gap that they had between the fixed exchange rate and the black market exchange rate, I don't know really what the alternative is at this point. It's very hard, and on the other hand, I'm not sure I'm familiar with enough with the current economic situation to really have a clear answer on that either. It's a very complicated, difficult situation, especially with the continuation of the sanctions, so I don't know, what they could be doing better in that sense at the moment. I mean, it's really still a crisis, an economic crisis. That's really the main point. In terms of, and let me just get to the question about the efforts to diversify the economy, and this kind of speaks to the larger economic question as well. This is something that, of course, Chavez definitely recognized the importance of diversifying the economy, and he actually had a really sound plan, I think, for doing that. And one should note, though, that many other governments before Chavez already had plans for diversifying the economy. Every government in Venezuela recognized this dependency on oil as being a problem. But the problem is that you have this massive oil wealth underneath the surface of the country that especially given the extent of economic need and social need that is in the country, you want to produce that oil and sell it and get revenue and use it for social programs or whatever, or infrastructure. And so the temptation to use that oil is tremendous. But the problem is, and this is known, but what economists call as the Dutch disease, which is that you have one economic sector that is predominant, and it floods the economy with petrodollars essentially, and grounds out all the other sectors and makes them relatively uncompetitive. Basically, it kills them off, and to maintain those other sectors would need either a stopping of the flow of oil into the economy, which is almost impossible for any politician to do in the context of a country such as Venezuela, or it would mean constantly subsidizing those other economic sectors, which is also very difficult to do because you have a fluctuation in the price of oil, you have a fluctuation in incomes, and so then these other industries go up and down with the price of oil as well, and it just creates an economic mess. Now, Chavez's plan actually was pretty sound. Unfortunately, he himself ended up undermining it. I hate to say this, but that is, the plan was very clear that to create a 5-year kind of a revenue average, so to speak, of targeting oil revenues in terms of the 5-year average of oil revenues. And if the if the revenues drop underneath that 5-year average, if it goes above that 5-year average, then you put it into a savings account, basically into a national wealth fund. And if it drops underneath that average, you can withdraw from that fund. That way, you would stabilize the income, and you'd be able to actually have a consistent effort to diversify the economy. Unfortunately, within a couple of years, the temptation was just too great to undermine that system, and it was basically dismantled. It never really was never really implemented. So that's another, actually, I would say, economic fault, really, of the Chavez government.
I just wanted to say, though, but the diversification of the economy in terms of relations to other countries. Chavez made a serious effort to diversify it. When Chavez took over, something like 98% of the economy was dependent on the U.S. Just diversifying its relations with other Latin American countries really was a very positive thing, not only to help those countries, in terms of their economies, but in reflection also diversify the Venezuelan economy and exchanges and more people participating in that economy. And I thought you need to make a point about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's not quite the same. I mean, I think that definitely was a huge improvement, in terms of diversifying the sources of foreign income. But it's not quite the same as diversifying the economy in terms of production. But that's actually something that Maduro actually ended up achieving. But kind of against his will, in the sense that it happened as a result of the sanctions. That is, the sanctions cut off a tremendous amount of imports, and therefore Venezuela was forced to diversify the economy, and that's what ended up happening. Venezuela now producing far more, I don't have the numbers unfortunately, but far more of its own food, its own food consumption is being produced domestically, far more than during the Chavez period. And that's because, you know, it just couldn't do it any other way because the oil revenues had declined so much. But yeah, I mean, I think, and then also the cooperation agreements that Chavez had introduced led to, you know, the building of, you know, let's say cell phone factories with Chinese help, and also the Chinese helped build a satellite for Venezuela, and all kinds of other sectors, and the Iranians helped in various other sectors. But it never really took off. That's the problem. I mean, there was, like I said, there was a tremendous amount of effort to diversify production, but it never really took off. In the end, still 90% of, by the end of Chavez's presidency, 90% of foreign income was still from oil, just as in the beginning. Then there was another question. Oh, in terms of the end of the Bolivarian Revolution. I don't know what the importance or significance is to say, to put an end date. I think decline for me is good enough. I do think there was, yeah, a different turn away from, you know, the achievements and the possibilities of the Bolivarian Revolution. And yeah, I don't think that we need to set a definite turning point, although if I had to set one, kind of, I don't know, I wouldn't do it. Because I do think there's still some important elements in terms of the Bolivarian Revolution, even though they're, you know, heavily impacted by all these external factors that I mentioned. But the most important one that I think is still important to maintain is you know, even though it's much more limited than before, is the participatory democracy elements, yeah, that's, to me, still one of the most important things, and the hope for the future, although it doesn't look that way. And the dismantling of representative democracy is definitely a huge problem. I would totally agree with that, and I think it became even more serious with the 2024 presidential election, which, like I said, has led to tremendous depoliticization. But at the same time, the communal councils are continuing. They're still organizing, and people are still involved with them. And it's, you know, smaller than it used to be, but that's still, for me at least, the hope for the future and the reason to maintain solidarity with Venezuela, even if we disagree with many of the things that Maduro is doing. And I totally, even though. I don't, I'm not a wholehearted supporter of Maduro at all, but at the same time, the alternative is so much worse, and that's the big problem. This could have been avoided many times. Many times it could have been avoided. Like if the opposition had participated in the 2018 election, that could have been avoided. Maduro was willing to do that, and they had a transparent electoral process in place that would have, I think, could have very easily led to the opposition winning the presidency. The conditions were absolutely there. Of course, the reason they didn't want to do that was because they knew that winning the presidency isn't good enough for them. They would not have had control over the police. They would not have control over and the military, and especially that. And they didn't want that, and so that's why they ended up boycotting the election. And actually, we had the same situation after the 2024 election. That is, the opposition participated in that one, but then afterwards there were negotiations about setting up a power-sharing agreement. And in the end, Maria Corina Machado, who was the de facto opposition leader, pulled out of an agreement. She said, we do not want, she said this very clearly, we do not want a power-sharing agreement, no matter, we want all of it, basically. But that's, you could have had a solution kind of like what happened in Nicaragua after the Sandinistas lost the elections in 1990. I think that would have been the most viable way out, so to speak, out of the mess that Venezuela currently finds itself in. But the opposition was refused to have that kind of result. But I think things would have been better than they are now.
All right, I think we will wrap up this forum. I want to thank everyone for coming, which was really amazing, this participation.